I lead EU and NATO studies at George Washington University in DC. We are a partner of Allied Command Transformation. That makes us NATO's main academic point of contact in DC. As luck would have it, the Atlantic Council is the main think tank, sort of partner of NATO's in DC. I'm affiliated with the Atlantic Council, so it's an honor and a pleasure to be here today to open this first panel. We were given a title that suggests that we will talk about pretty much everything, and that our mission in life will be to leave the other panels with nothing left to say. Let me quickly introduce our panelists. First on my left, Trond Helleland, who's the head of the Norwegian Parliament's delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I just assume that everybody's aware of how the NATO Parliamentary Assembly works here. Then Raimond Kaljulaid from the Estonian Parliament. Let me try and pronounce it Riigikogu.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I think so.
Very, very good.
Who also chairs, he's on the National Defense Committee of the Estonian Parliament, and if his last name rings a bell, it should. Fred Kamp is the President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and over his tenure has grown the Atlantic Council from an organization that was mostly in the lead on NATO studies into one of the top think tank in DC on essentially all subject matters, thematic and geographical. And previously his claim to fame was he was a long-time editor at the Wall Street Journal. Last but not least, Derek Twigg from the House of Parliament in the British Parliament, who's also the head of the British delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and a member of the intelligence and security community. Given what the task of this panel, what we should get straight to it. Obviously, I'm going to try and make it as interactive as possible with the audience, but I think that I have a good sense of what many in the audience will be asking themselves. So let me try. Obviously, an update on NATO's posture vis-à-vis Russian aggression in Ukraine and Russian gray zone and hybrid. A couple of points on this. I mean, the news today is Germany's inaugurating its permanent brigade in Lithuania. Are we finally moving from the small footprint NATO enhanced presence in the east, so deterrence by tripwire, to deterrence by punishment, NATO's actual ability to stop a Russian aggression or deter a Russian aggression other than just by telling them that a Russian aggression would likely impact small numbers of Allied troops in the east. Trond.
Yeah, thank you. First, say I'm glad to be here in Dayton, and of course we are here for a special occasion, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and also for the 30 years of the Dayton Accord. So indeed, we are in a historical place, in a historical time. Just today, Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, is in Norway. He's visiting our government and inspecting our troops, I hope. Yesterday we got the news that Finland just has opened many new kilometers of their border fence against Russia. 2 days ago we got the news that Russians have been piling up helicopters and stuff, not so many troops because they are somewhere else. Along the border of Finland, and so we see there is a development all the time. But what I'm glad to notice is that there is a strong support for Ukraine, for the freedom fight of Ukraine. in Europe, and I also see now that the US Senate has discussed or are discussing a bill against the Russian aggression headed by Lindsey Graham. I think that's very important because we need to be very clear that their fight for freedom is our fight for freedom. We have to be clear about that. I feel that Europe is stepping up. We are spending more. We are totally agreeing on the goals that we should have a free Europe with a free Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Raymond, you're at the front line, including the other piece of news from not too long ago is as the Estonians were trying to intercept a vessel from the Shadow Fleet, the Russians are back at their old games of buzzing your airspace and so on. What can you tell us? In terms, I suppose, what I have in mind is there has been a debate among think tankers on both sides of the Atlantic as to how long we have to boost our ability to deter the Russians more forcefully than has been the case so far, and you know how long would it take the Russians to reset? What's your take from an Estonian perspective?
Okay, so first of all, of course, I want to also say I'm really happy to be here in Ohio. Back in the 90s, I had the privilege, my family hosted some university students from Ohio, so I have like a personal connection with this place. Coming to your question, first of all, I want to push back. Of course, Estonia is one of the countries bordering Russia, as is Norway and Finland, but the whole of NATO is on the front line. I see my German colleagues here. I mean, I'm sure the German colleagues understand, and the French, that if it comes to war, there will not be a safe space in Europe. You're not going to be safe whether you're in the Baltics or you're in Portugal. You're going to be affected by that war. The Russians pose an imminent threat to NATO security. If you read the public reports, for instance, of our Foreign Intelligence Service, which you can just download on the internet, they're available in English, you see that the Russians are building a huge conventional army poised to confront NATO. We're talking about probably a mass army of 1.5 million troops facing our region in the coming years. So we're in this race for time, and if you look at the situation from a perspective of a Russian planner or somebody close to the Russian President Vladimir Putin, they might pose the question, well, why give Europe time to get its act together? Why give Europe time to rearm? So if we are slower than they are, and at the moment, I would draw your attention that according to an estimate of a British think tank, the Russians actually outspent the European nations in terms of defense. If you take into consideration the differences in prices, the Russians have spent more on their military than we have. So we're in this race, and the only way to prevent a major confrontation in Europe, or I would say the only way to prevent the major war we have in Ukraine just spreading out even into a real nightmare scenario, is to really build up our deterrence fast. That's what we need to do. Yeah.
Fred, you're an especially astute observer of Germany, so let me try this. I mean, do you see the advent of the Merz government, even though it happened in somewhat difficult circumstances, as a key turning point with I'm thinking of the watering down of the debt limit and maybe the ability now of the German government to really turn its Zeitenwende, as it's called, into reality in the coming years. Is that a key sign that Europe is stepping up in your view, or is it making too much of German initiatives?
So thank you for that, and thank you all for being here. So part of the title of this conference is Inflection Point, and in my own view, we're at the fourth inflection point, serious inflection point for American leadership in the world since the end of World War I. And at the end of World War I, we got it tragically wrong. We sunk into isolationism after having a good showing in World War I. The League of Nations failed, had the rise of fascism, World War II, the Holocaust, millions of dead. The end of World War II, we did something aberrational in American history, and it's because we had the experience of 2 world wars. And those were the founders of the Atlantic Council, Dean Acheson, Henry Cabot Lodge, Mary Pillsbury Lord. And we built multilateral institutions. We stayed in Europe, we stayed in Asia, We worked with our former, you mentioned the Germans, and I mentioned the Japanese as well. We made our two major adversaries, our two major allies. The third inflection point was the period after the Cold War, not as positive as the period after World War II, not as negative period after World War I. And now I would say with the Ukraine war and the post-Ukraine war is a fourth inflection point, and this gets to your question on Germany. I just came back from Brussels, and there are two individuals who are really driving change in Europe right now, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. And without those two individuals, Europe would not be rearming the way it's rearming right now. And I'm not sure that Donald Trump hasn't had more influence. You say Trump and you see what happens in the room. But I'm not sure that Donald Trump hasn't had more influence, because you had the invasion in February 2022, but Europe still didn't do everything it needed to do. And so what I'm hoping, this inflection point, is that there will be a burden sharing and a burden shifting, but that the US will stay in Europe and will stay allied in Europe and will be a backstop for whatever happens in Ukraine. And so I think this is an absolutely crucial moment. Without what the US is doing in terms of putting pressure on allies to come up, not to 2%, but to 5%, and that'll be a 3.5% of GDP on defense. 1.5% will probably be infrastructure related to defense. We just came back from seeing the Secretary General Rutte in Brussels. But I think this is a hinge point. And this takes us back to Dayton. I think we can't forget that that's what we're commemorating here. It was a huge success. It was a mixture of diplomacy and military power. It was US determination. But let's not forget it was European failure. It was 4 years of failure. 100,000 dead. Srebrenica, a genocide, perhaps the worst thing in Europe since the war. And it was only after that failure that the US stepped in. The US is now saying it's not going to step in on Ukraine. That means Europe has to step in. This gets to my Estonian colleague's friend, is Europe ready to step in? My answer would be not entirely yet. And the question is, will we shift in an orderly enough fashion that we can stop the worst from happening in Ukraine? Because if we lose in Ukraine, it will have the same historic consequence as if we had lost in Berlin during the Cold War. And then all bets are off. And so I just think we're gathering here in Dayton at a crucial moment. And I think we have to remember the lesson of Dayton is the mixture of power and political will and allied unity, but it's also a lesson of 4 years of failure of deterrence. And we're now in 3 years of a failure of deterrence on Ukraine. And so I think for this whole weekend, we have to keep talking about the lessons of Dayton, both in a positive sense, what we have to do, but also, how much further do we have to go in Ukraine before we get our act together?
I recall that one of the infamous quotes speaking as a European from the series of historical events that led to Dayton is Luxembourg Foreign Minister Jacques Pause saying that the hour of Europe had come to solve the Balkan Wars in 1991, and it hadn't. It took Richard Holbrooke to actually fix the... So I keep recalling that quote when I see that we're now back to exploring ways in which the hour of Europe might dawn upon us again. Derek, a couple of things. In the last few months of his tenure, Secretary General Stoltenberg tried to, shall we say, Trump-proof some of the Western support to Ukraine by creating what's called NSATU, essentially taking up some of the responsibility for coordinating Western aid to Ukraine, bringing it in-house inside NATO. Meanwhile, I suppose in your case, the UK is very busy training Ukraine forces. I think it's called Operation Interflex, right? Is NATO now, with the ups and downs of this narrative about whether the Americans were about to stop their support for Ukraine and so on, how do you feel that NATO is performing in terms of European NATO allies, in your case the UK, in sticking to the plan and supporting Ukraine in ways that they can outlast Russia at least?
No, thanks. And it's a real pleasure to be here in Dayton. I know the work that Congressman Mike Turner has put in to ensure that this happens, this event, and it's really, I've been really struck by how friendly folks are in Dayton, so it's a real pleasure to be here. I think 2 or 3 things I'd want to say. There is no doubt, as Fred and others have alluded to here, that Europe over-relied on the US for its defence, that despite the warnings in terms of the Russian incursion in Georgia and then Donbass and Crimea, we didn't really get it then, and I think we were complacent. And obviously since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, things have started to change quite drastically. But even then, in Europe, it wasn't enough. It was too slow to react. Yes, of course, we've all given support. I mean, in terms of the UK, along with the US and Germany, we're the biggest contributors to supporting Ukraine. You mentioned training. I think it's something like 53,000 Ukrainian service personnel that have been trained by the UK in recent years. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of people, and I know the work that, talking to our armed forces, the work they're doing there. But I think, as the Prime Minister Keir Starmer said, and was clear in our manifesto when we had the election last year, is that our policy is NATO first in the UK. And we believe that is the body that we must go forward with when we defend Europe and deal with the Russians. Now, we in NATO, I think, if we're going to be honest about it, we know there's a capability gap. We know we have problems with the defence industrial base, where we need to really quicken up our productivity and ability to produce weapons and equipment and fill those capability gaps, and also have better cooperation between NATO countries and European countries, not least in terms of interoperability. I mean, some of the stories you hear about the failings there when there's been no interoperability are pretty frightening. But I'd also say this, because you mentioned the US position and posture and whether they're taking a further back step in Europe. I think, as Prime Minister Starmer said, it's not about Europe or the USA, it's about having relationships with both, about working together. And if any lessons are to be learned, going back to Fred's point about the Second World War in Dayton, is an alliance is crucial, working together, supporting each other, and that's what NATO's about. And I think that is crucial to taking this forward. I do think there's a realisation in Europe generally now. Some countries will need to do more. I mean, the UK has already said that it will fast-track the commitment to 2.5% spend on defence in this Parliament and 3% by the next Parliament. There are some voices, and this is my individual opinion, that that's still not enough and we need to go faster. But that is a major commitment from the UK to increase its defence expenditure, and we'll see what the spending review that's taking place in the UK will do as well. So I think, yes, NATO is certainly ramping up. It's certainly moving quicker. There are obvious weaknesses and concerns that we need to address further, which I just outlined. But I think we're in a better position than what we were 2 or 3 years ago. Thank you.
I suppose the second question that's on everybody's mind is NATO and China, NATO and the Indo-Pacific. We're about to have I believe the 4th summit in a row where we've invited the Indo-Pacific 4, NATO's partners in the region. It looked like NATO was on its way to find some sort of alignment between NATO, Europe, and the US in terms of what to say, how to characterize China between 2019 and 2022. And the latest summit communique, NATO agreed on describing China as a decisive enabler of the war in Ukraine and as a challenger. Is it your view that now especially the decisive enabler part of the picture here is so concerning that NATO should or will be pressed by the US administration to go one step further and actually add China to the list of adversaries, which right now NATO describes its top 2 threats as Russia and terrorism? But I mean, in your case, Trond, let's look at the Arctic. China says it's a near Arctic power. It says by 2030 it will be a great Arctic power. Is everything that you do in the Arctic already about China, or is it way too soon to say so?
Well, Norway, with a short border to Russia, has always had this dual face policies against Russia, because we know they can be aggressive, but we also know we have to cooperate about fisheries, search and rescue, stuff like that. But last week we had a NATO PA delegation up to Svalbard, the Spitsbergen archipelago, far north, 82 degrees north. And what we know in Norway is that Norway has to be, or at least we try to be, the eyes and ears of NATO in the north. And that meaning you have the biggest fleet base, the biggest nuclear base close to the Norwegian border in Murmansk. And when you go out with the submarines, it's quite shallow water, so we can follow them. And then it drops down to 5,000 meters. Then it's harder to follow it. So we are spending both a lot of resources, money, and great cooperation with the NATO allies, with the US, with the Europeans, following the movements of the Northern Fleet. That's very important for us. And then on the other hand, we have the Chinese aspirations to become an Arctic nation, or to have more interest, and it's all about the climate change and the possibilities of a northern sea route. And China is very interested in that. But still, it's a long way from China to Norway. But it can be much shorter if that sea route
There's
opens.
only one country in between.
Yeah, it's only one country in between. And we see, in a way, that the Chinese are active, trying to purchase land and stuff like that, but it's all stopped by Norwegian authorities, and I think that the same it's the same all over, at least Northern Europe now, that let's say 10, 15 years ago, this would have been unnoticed, or it would have been possible for the Chinese to buy land or property, harbors, the Silk Route and so on. Now it's much more awareness. So we have to watch out, but of course it's Russia that's the main problem, the main aggressor, and we have to be alert on what's going on. And at least just also in Norway we see the hybrid threats, we see propaganda for Russian interests and so on. It doesn't bite very much on the population, but still they are trying all the time, and we should be cautious in Europe now, because we have vulnerable states, for example Moldova. What's going on there, what will go on there. It was a good election there for the president, but there are new elections coming up, and I think we have to be prepared that the Russians don't only use their military power, they use a lot of their other stuff as well, propaganda.
Raymond, we've seen the falling out of love between Central, Northeastern Europe and China. There used to be the 17+1, which is now kind of down to 0+1. I was struck as well by your esteemed compatriot Kaja Kallas's testimony to, or at least confirmation hearing in the EU context now. She's the head of the EU's diplomatic service. And she was adamant and unapologetic in characterizing China as an adversary. Never mind the stuff about China being a negotiating partner and so on. What can you tell us from your perspective? Obviously, you have to focus on Russia, but do you accept that at least there's an axis of autocracies, and that is the real problem?
Yeah, well, let's make it very simple. So, both Russia and China and their allies and partners that they've got, they don't have many, but they have some, they're not happy with the state of affairs in the world today. So they're looking to change their status, they're looking to have more influence, and both of them want to resolve certain territorial issues. So this is what actually Russia is working on in Ukraine. They see Ukraine as historically part of the Russian Empire, and they're trying to restore that. And the same is true for China, especially in regard to Taiwan. And I think the confrontation with Taiwan might be closer than many people realize. Now, these kind of balances of power, they shift all the time. The question of diplomacy and what we're all trying to achieve is to make sure that these shifts take place, in a negotiated way, that they don't lead to a direct confrontation. Because if it leads to direct confrontation and ties in the West and NATO, it means that many people in my family in Estonia and many people here in Ohio will be in the fight. So we want to prevent that. Now, the problem is that I sense that some in the U.S. have this idea of doing like another Kissinger, of trying to drive a wedge between China and Russia. And I've got news for you. That ain't going to happen. That is not going to happen. It is impossible at the moment. The tie between them is very, very strong. And when they look at us, they see us as divided, and they see that as an opportunity. So in order to counter both threats, I mean, there's not even a point really of scaling them and saying, well, the Russia threat is bigger, or this makes no sense. I mean, they can both create tremendous destruction and tremendous loss of life if they decide to do that. So I think our task in NATO is to stick together and do everything in our power to take the military option off the table for both of them. That means, of course, we need to stop the Russian aggression in Ukraine, stop it in its tracks, secure Ukraine with a credible commitment also by the Western allies. That's very important. And we also need to convince China. And we don't do that with words, and we don't do that with flattery. The only way to do that is through strength. And we need to convince China that there's no sense in using force to achieve its aims, that it's better not to put that option on the table. And for that, we really, really need to stick together. That's the main point. The worst thing that could happen, I'm going to finish, is we see Russia and China, what they're doing with their all kinds of hybrid and all levels. They're trying to divide us. They're trying to divide the US and Europe. They're trying to divide Europeans amongst themselves. And our job is not to let that happen. We got to stick together, and we got to prove to these autocracies that, no, we're strong, we're determined, take the military option off the table, and everything will be fine.
May I pick up on this? So I want to applaud as well and jump in here. This axis of autocrats, or whatever you want to call it, which is China and Russia, which formed a no-limits partnership right ahead of the Ukraine invasion. And it's become deeper since then. And you add North Korea and Iran to that. There are other countries as well, but those are the four primary ones. Their defense industrial cooperation is closer and more troubling than Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese was at the time in the 1930s. And you just have to absorb that. I think it can be disrupted. Maybe not Kissinger in the way, but I think over time it can be. But right now, I think it's really difficult, and therefore one has to come together. I think the false choice that has been put on the table by some in the U.S. is Europe should handle Europe. We're going to handle Asia. Therefore, we're going to move out of our European responsibilities, and you should not waste your time in Asia. They are linked. And if you don't believe they're linked, you need to talk to President Xi and President Putin, because they know they're linked. And so I think it's absolutely, absolutely crucial to watch this. In that respect, we also have to watch what's going on in China. China is racing ahead of us in terms of defense industry. Right. Not slowly catching up. Racing in terms of its building program, in terms of its technology. One of the things we really saw in this Indo-Pakistan conflict is we all talk about the DeepSeek moment where China came through with DeepSeek, and suddenly we saw that the margin had been closed between China and the United States in terms of artificial intelligence development. Well, we saw Chinese technology being used on Pakistani planes and for the Pakistani military perform in a way we didn't think it could perform. It's been a shock, and people are calling it a deep-seek moment in military, and it hasn't broken through yet. But you know, we're not going to be able to counter that alone. The United States, certainly Europe isn't going to. So we have to do it together. And I think this should be a galvanizing moment that we see with this. We see the direction things are going in. So I wanted to, you know, not only support what my Estonian colleague said, but also carry it a step further, and say that we really need the alliance to not to be separated, but to be united, working on both fronts with burden sharing, burden shifting. You know, clearly we're going to take more of a lead in Asia, and Europe over time has to take more of a lead in Europe. But for either one of us not to pay attention to the other front doesn't really understand the way the world works right now.
By the way, Fred, do you have a special insight that you can share with us on, you know, Zelensky's revelations about the presence of Chinese nationals on the front lines, and the old question whether they are sent by someone or whether they are they are there on their own behalf? Anything that
in Russia?
Yeah.
Well, the North Koreans we know
Yeah.
are for the drones from the Iranians, they're just amazing. By the way, one of the things that's interesting is Ukraine. What an incredible country.
Yeah.
And they're going to produce this year 3.5–4 million drones from zero, and they're going to produce them in the country. But anyway, but they're up against this one country with military support from a lot of different people, but they're up against North Korean troops on the ground, Chinese technology, Iranian technology. You know, the Russians are much more all in at the moment than we are all in. And so I don't know the answer to your question about the Chinese. I know they've been showing up. So far, I think there's more concern regarding the North Korean participation.
Derek, as a Brit, and I'm originally French, the French and the British have danced to their own separate tune within NATO in terms of we don't need to pivot to the Indo-Pacific because we're already there, right? Especially the French with their fully sovereign territories in the region. Do you feel that there's the two caucuses emerging within NATO, that those that get it versus not, in terms of how NATO ought to be active, not only take on China at home in terms of Chinese threat on European infrastructure and so on, but really develop NATO's military relevance in the Indo-Pacific?
I think it's clear that the view we have is that Ukraine is a priority in Europe. It has to be. In terms of the Indo-Pacific, clearly the UK, that's France, has specific interests. We've got connections that go back centuries, relationships. Clearly everyone's got a vested interest in the free movement of trade through those seas. We're sending a carrier group through to that region at the moment. So I think we do have an interest, and we need to maintain that. Clearly, the US is the primary force there. They clearly have huge resources. In terms of what and if in the future that Europe can provide, if required, is I think an open question. But I think it's clear that the priority for us at the moment is Ukraine, for obvious reasons. But I just want to come back onto a couple of things that people have said. I think this, and it's been mentioned, but I just want to emphasise how I think it's really, really worrying that this access between Iran, there's not been mentioned, it's briefly named, or North Korea, Russia and China, the closer cooperation between those four countries, regardless of the fact that we've got North Korean troops in around Russia and Ukraine, I think is really worrying, a really worrying development, and a real threat to our way of life and the future prosperity and peace. So I think that's something. I mean, in terms of China, I think we overestimated the ability of the Russian armed forces because we've seen what happened in Ukraine, and what the Ukrainians has done is just been absolutely quite remarkable, and their ability to adapt on the battlefield, never mind elsewhere, to changing circumstances and technology. This has been quite remarkable, and we've got to learn some serious lessons from that. Now, in terms of the capability of, because the discussion in the last 10 minutes has been about China, their capability, it is right, as has been mentioned, their abilities to produce and rearm and arm and new technology and equipment is quite remarkable at the moment. Clearly, their troops haven't been combat tested, so that would be interesting, you know, if that ever comes to that. But their ability to produce, whether it's ships, submarines, craft, and we've seen, as we mentioned, what happened in between India and Pakistan, it is very, very worrying. And I was struck I was in the shipyard down at Norfolk earlier this week, and we passed the souvenir shop there, and they have T-shirts and coffee mugs, etc. But the emblem was that with a huge aircraft carrier emblazoned on the T-shirt or on a mug, saying 100,000 tons of diplomacy. Now, I think we can only have peace through strength. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the Chinese in any way. We have to recognise that the threat is building and great, and we know what Gia said in terms of 2027. So I think, to sum up my answer to your question, is for Europeans, I think it has to be Ukraine first, but we clearly need to develop the strategy of how and when, if we need to do more in the Indo-Pacific. And I think we can get into all the other issues about the cyber attacks, about hybrid warfare, etc., which is going on, cutting undersea cables, which is a growing problem at the moment. But I think that there are clear lessons. There is this access now, and they mean business, and they have a view, a world view, and they don't recognise weakness, they recognise strength. Yeah.
I suppose in the French case, the factory that brings this home, if you will, is the Chinese produce the equivalent of the French Navy every 4 years. Well, I think Raymond, you wanted to follow.
Yes, I wanted to cut in real fast. So one of my jobs is we have a defense industry support group in the Estonian Parliament. And I lead that, so I work on defense industry matters a lot. When we talk about China, is that so somebody mentioned drones. So if you look at drones produced in the West and in NATO countries, and you break them down into components, so you have motors coming from China, or even if the motor is made in Europe or the US, you have components, magnets coming from China. So now we're all talking about we need to get defense spending up to 5+% So Estonia already, we're committed. Before the Hague summit, we don't need anybody to remind us we're going above 5% anyway next year. So one of the things I think we have to make sure in the North Atlantic community is that money now doesn't go to one of our main adversaries, to China, but that money needs to create jobs in Europe, it needs to create jobs here in the US, it needs to create jobs here in Ohio, not somewhere in China. That's a crucial thing. We really got to look into our supply lines, and we systematically have to make sure that we produce everything we need from the very essence of things in the North Atlantic community countries. And so that none of that money that we're spending on defense will leak to our adversaries. This was the mistake that Europe made before the Ukrainian war, when we had massive flows of capital into Russia, which they used to build an army to attack us. And we're still buying too much stuff from Russia in Europe. And this is something that I think both our French and UK colleagues and Norwegians can do more about. But it's really important to keep that in mind. No US dollars, no euros should go to China.
The third topic that is self-evident for this conversation is one that has come up already, is the US's posture in NATO. Now, we should have learned from the first Trump administration that there's a difference between tweets, or now whatever they're called, truth, social, versus actions. Now, the Europeans, in part, to be honest, because of statements from J.D. Vance, from Secretary Hexeth, aren't they getting ahead of themselves in assuming, in taking it as a premise that the US is on its way to disengage from NATO? We see Secretary Rubio, and now apparently the trick to hang out with Trump is to be an excellent golf player, like Alexander Stubb is. And so we see more reassuring signals. But three three litmus tests that I'd like to get your insights on is this leak about the US giving up the secure position, number one. Number two, potential concerns about even the US ending its extended nuclear deterrence in Europe. And number three, obviously this notion that the US would withdraw its conventional forces, 100,000-ish, either entirely from Europe or at least reallocate them from Germany to the east. Do you take any of these three examples seriously, Trond?
Well, it's so many both truths and tweets and development is it's a bit unsecure what's really happening. My prime minister or our prime minister with Jens Stoltenberg, our new finance minister, were in the White House a few weeks ago. Trump reassured that we were good allies, we are doing a great job. He just said a couple of days ago that Finland and Norway is safe and so on. So it's always mixed signals. But what really didn't really start with Trump, but it started earlier. Europe needs to defend themselves stronger, and I think the point is taken now. It's a big shift in spending. The problem is the production capacity and how we can rearm Europe in a good way. But let's say for the Nordic area, there's been the invasion of Ukraine has made a big shift. Suddenly all the Nordic countries are members of NATO. Finland and Sweden has joined. One of the first things that came out of it was that the Norwegian, Swedish, Danish and Finnish Air Force unite their strength. So we will have like at least 120 F-35s and 150 Swedish fighter planes together under one command if there's a threatening situation. That's totally new. We had Sweden and Finland outside NATO, Norway with a short border to Russia, and now we're all together. So there has been a shift, not only because of Trump, but also because of Putin and his actions. And it has worked the other way than Putin thought. He would divide Europe. He has united Europe. And now we need to unite Europe and the US in keeping the Americans inside Europe with their troops, really reinforce the transatlantic ties. And of course, it's mixed signals all the time, but I think in the end, the Americans are there to help us, to be our most important ally. And we should step up both our production and our commitment to the defense. And I think that's what's happening in Europe now. It's a bit slow. I went to the EPP Congress in Valencia a few weeks ago, and Friedrich Merz was there before he was the new chancellor, and he said that Europe is world champions in producing rules. We should be world champions in producing products. And I think that's very true. We are an over-regulated society, and we need to deregulate. We need to start competing, because the total economic strength of Europe is huge. It's big possibilities, and we need to get them out.
That's coming from a Norwegian who has to follow the rules.
Yeah, we follow the rules, and now Britain has made a new agreement with the EU as well. But here we are, 3 Europeans and 2 outside the EU, so maybe the EU people should speak.
Raymond, do you take all of the incidents I mentioned with a grain of salt, or?
Well, you mentioned J.D. Vance, so if anybody in the audience knows J.D. Vance, can you please give him my phone number? I'd love to talk to this guy.
Sure.
I'd love to tell him a few things about the region and have a robust debate with him. But sometimes also, you know, if you look at what has created tension, so J.D. Vance came to Munich and said that Europe has a free speech problem, and everybody went berserk in Europe and said this is really inappropriate and what have you. And then most recently, The Economist, which is a British very respectable paper, published its kind of op-ed, and said that, well, you know, Vance may not have been very polite in the way he said it, but he's right, that Europe actually has a free speech problem. So sometimes, you know, like, I think these media storms or things get us kind of disoriented. I have great faith in the United States. If you take Estonia, my country, in 1991, we regained independence from Russia. It was quickly recognized by the West, but what people forget is that we had Soviet troops in the country, in bases. I used to live next to a literal Soviet military. Looking out from my second floor window in the apartment that I still live in, there was a huge area of a military base. And these only left in 1994, and they left only because the US administration back in the day put tremendous pressure on Russia to take these troops out of the Baltics, because of course the Russians were dragging their feet and trying to break the agreements that they made with us, as they always do. So the US played a hugely positive role then. Then Yeltsin tried to pressure Clinton into signing something that NATO is not going to expand into the Baltics. Clinton basically told him to go to hell, very politely. He said, Boris, you know, we're not going to do that. And then NATO expansion came. If it wasn't for NATO expansion, if the Baltics would not be in NATO today, I would be sitting here talking to you about the war in Eastern Estonia. So that's just a fact. So the U.S. has played a tremendously positive role in our region, and we really value that relationship. And the last thing I want to say about that, you have this saying by one of your prominent politicians that you have this big, beautiful ocean between you and Europe. So when it comes to geography, you're completely right. There's a big ocean between you and Europe. But when it comes to values and principles and how we like to live and how we like to govern ourselves, we are neighbors. We're next-door neighbors. And there's a tremendous dark ocean between you guys and us and Russia and China. So I think that at the end of the day, you know, whatever is said and done and whatever happens on Truth Social or on X or any of these platforms, at the end of the day, it's the values and the common way of life that we have that binds us together, and we just have to keep that in mind. And again, yeah, if anybody knows J.D. Vance, give him my number, please.
But
he is Ohio, you know.
Yeah, that's what I said. I think probably like there's friends of his here in the audience.
I just sent him an email. So.
Yeah, text him. Do you have a signal?
I can get Tony. Can't reveal that.
Fred, on values, though, can I add? Do you think that we're headed towards a bit of a political crisis on values at NATO because of the administration's pushback on anything to do with women, peace, security, and climate? We're already getting signals that NATO is watering down or shifting some of its language to not, so that it doesn't show up on DOGE-style databases, or is that also a red herring in your view?
So I've been spending a good amount of time in Europe recently, and there's reaction to Trump in a healthy way, which is increasing arms, laying out where the differences are, but that we're all in this together. And then there's hysteria. And I think there's a level of hysteria that I think goes way beyond anything the President of the United States has said. You're going to see our ambassador to NATO here this weekend, Matt Whitaker, and he was just in Estonia. Yeah. And he said, you know, there's all this talk about whether the U.S. is going to reposition its troops and leave Europe in the lurch. And he signaled, no, that's not going to be the case. Anything that's happened would be in collaboration with. The president has said nothing about, quote unquote, pulling out of NATO or not standing by Article 5. And he's actually, he is going to be in Hague at the summit, and he's going to push for even more spending. So I think the language, the language of our president is not something that Europe or a lot of people are accustomed to. And that's his political style. That's what he does, is he shocks people into action, and he shocks people into reaction of what they want to do. And I think what Peter Thiel, the great technologist from Silicon Valley, said during the first Trump administration is you have to take him seriously, but not literally. I think in this administration you have to take him literally more often. But also don't put ideas into his mouth that have not been said.
Right.
So I'm happy for the reaction in Europe. If the outcome is Europe carrying more of its weight, if the outcome is better trade deals for everybody, if we can get to zero tariffs, I mean, that would be the ideal outcome. I'm not the biggest fan of this administration's tariff approach. I'm more with the Wall Street Journal on that page. But I think one also has to say, this is a time for burden shifting, not just burden sharing. And if you can either use a disruptive moment to land in a better place, or you can use a disruptive moment to land in a worse place. Right. And so I think it's up to us right now to use this disruptive moment, which can be really useful if it's used constructively. And I think that's what we all have to we all have to work at doing. I think the jury is out, and I think we're going to watch primarily in Ukraine where this lands. Right. Can we get to a position in Ukraine where Europe takes on a lot more of the burden, but where the U.S. understands that Europe isn't ready to take on all of the burden yet? If you're going to do security guarantees for Ukraine, there's got to be an American backup. Yep. There has to be American intelligence involved. There has to be an American portion involved. And my guess is that will be there when Europe really fully steps up. And so I'm holding my breath because I think it's the Europe hour. And I think crisis brings Europe forward, but sometimes Europe doesn't move as much as it should when it should.
Yeah. Well, you tee up my final question to you, Derek, in 30 seconds if you can, but we're about a month out from the next NATO summit at The Hague. Question is simple enough, is what's a successful outcome in your view from The Hague summit on June 25th? What makes you happy coming out of The Hague versus not?
You could say a happy President Trump. I think basically that we're unified, that we remain strong, we strengthen the coalition, that we see further and real commitment to increase expenditure, tackling the industrial base problems in terms of productivity, that we have a very clear view strategically about where we want to be as an organisation. And that, as you talked about before, obviously Ukraine is the priority in terms of Europe, but again, the Asia-Pacific, how do we feel about that? But I think, to me, it's that we come away unified, together, clear about where we want to go, and have a clear strategy about that.
Thank you. Well, we have about 15 minutes. I suppose let's take several questions at a time, otherwise we'll surely be short on time. I believe we have roaming mics, and I see a lady here at the front. And if you could identify yourself as well, please.
So I'm Cheryl Gallant, and I'm from Canada. We've listened to the discussion on the situation from the Atlantic Council and have heard about the impacts on Europe and United States. My question is, has Canada's truancy in military spending diminished Canada's standing within NATO to the point that we are no longer considered a reliable partner?
Thank you. Let's see if we have any other takers, or we'll answer this one right away. Yeah.
Oh, very briefly, Canada is present in Latvia, which is just to the south of Estonia. The whole region is deeply grateful to Canada for its contribution to the security of the Baltics. And as far as from our corner of the world, Canada is a valued partner, and we love you from the bottom of my heart. And I was just in Canada, amazing place.
If we had somebody
likewise.
Dutch here, actually Alexandra can
Just very quickly, we're going to be building out our work on Canada because it is so deeply important to us. And congratulations to Mark Carney, who I think there's a way to approach the president and there's a way not to, and he was just incredibly clever in the White House, and I think he's a really good advocate for Canada. And it's a country that's only going to gain in its strategic importance, partly because of its geographic positioning. and partly because if you look at most of the military things we've been engaged in as the US, Canada's been right by our side all the time.
Anybody else on Canada?
No, just echo that. Obviously, Canada's a very,
Yeah.
greatly valued and a very important partner.
It's quite a trajectory
Otherwise, he
from...
wouldn't want you as the 51st state if you weren't so important. Sorry, it's a little lighthearted, but actually, if you look at the map and you look at Canada and Greenland, you actually see what President Trump is, not that he's going to do this, but you actually see the geopolitical picture that he's looking at. I mean, it's just massive, with the Arctic going where it's going and with warming going where it's going, you know, the strategic importance will just keep growing as well.
My name is Tim Patterson, and I'm addressing the gentleman with his. When Winston and Betty were in China, and Winston was our first ambassador after George H.W. was our envoy, and he was having a conversation with his compatriot in the Chinese government, and he asked about Taiwan, and the Chinese guy said, they were gone for 700 years once, they'll come back again.
Yes, and there's a related, probably apocryphal quote by Xu Enlai when he was asked about the French Revolution and its legacy, and he said it's too early to tell. Anybody would like to elaborate on that? I guess strategic patience is the point.
I think it was more of a comment than a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Over here, please. Or do you have
yes.
somebody? I'm so sorry.
Hi, good morning. My name is George Olson. I work with an NGO on security analysis. My question is about the defense industrial base and the supply chains. And what I'm wondering, you talked about drones and the components that are made, mostly in China. What initiatives are there, both in Europe and in the United States, to rebuild factories to manufacture small motors in Europe or in the United States, and to source the materials mined from NATO-friendly countries rather than sourcing materials in a location in China or having the rare earths being processed in China? I know there's Mountain Pass Mine in California they're trying to restart, but that's only one. So what other initiatives are there to rebuild the defense industrial base at this lower level?
I'd suggest we turn to Derek for this one, including because what's news as well is the EU-UK summit on Monday with a defense and security agreement that puts you in play to access some of the new EU funding. So what's your reaction, Derek?
No, yes, absolutely. I think that's, again, Keir Starmer and various leaders in Europe have been working closely together. But clearly the agreement between the UK and Europe is very, very important in terms of closer cooperation on a variety of things, including on defence. So that's one initiative. Also really looking at how we finance rearming and getting the financial institutions having the money there to be able to build the factories and the initiatives and the equipment and deal with the capability gaps. That's all being looked at, and there's talk of having a central bank to do that. So there's some of the initiatives we have there. I think also I'd say that there has been a clear realisation, and it's been there for some time now, but I think it's stepping up, that we really have to move quicker and faster. But part of the problem, as you alluded to, is getting the materials that we need to be able to produce, for instance, shells. But also, I think we learned lessons from how Ukraine have been able to ramp up their industrial base very, very quickly. And I think you referred to drones again. And again, there is an example of what Ukraine have done, and about the UK, for instance, what we can give to them and other countries can give to them in terms of drones and other equipment. But I think the lessons we've got to learn, that the way Ukraine has adapted and used and built up their defence and industrial base shows it can be done. We have to have the will, the resources, and the ability to do that. So I think most certainly NATO, it's a big issue, and every time we get together and talk about that. And everything I think possibly is being done to actually improve that situation. Are we going fast enough? Probably not. We have to do more, but there are certain limitations, not least, of course, is having the right skilled workforce in place to be able to do that. And that's another key thing about training up a workforce that can deliver these important things that we need in terms of defending ourselves in the future.
Fred, can I ask you, do you feel that the trade wars or tensions between the US and the EU might jump policy fields and end up turning into an issue for the ability to develop a sensible transatlantic defense industrial base? I would simply point out as well that the forgotten article in the Washington Treaty is Article 2, the Canadian article that says that NATO should also be in the business of ensuring peaceable and collaborative economic relationships, and we tend to forget about that one. But Fred.
Yeah, people forget that article, but it is a NATO article on economic cooperation and also to avoid economic conflicts as well. So I'm very short on defense industrial base, which will segue to the other answer. There are three issues, and right now NATO is going to announce something at the Hague Summit. I've forgotten what it's called, but it is aimed at accelerating the creation of a transatlantic defense industrial base. And then I think it's 800 billion euros that's coming from the EU right now, 150 billion in loans, 800 billion otherwise. Here's the problem. It's production, it's policy, and it's politics. So in production, you're going to have all this money out there with nothing to buy, or not enough to buy. We're not producing weapons quickly enough. We're not on war footing, and China is, and Russia is, North Korea is, and you know, if we're in Ukraine to win, you know, the Ukrainians have been fighting for their lives, so they had to do away with a lot of bureaucracy, just get things done. And I think this is one. You talked about Europe. Europe is the superpower regulator. Can it get out of its own way to get this done? And the lifting of the debt limit in Germany is a good sign. You know, that we thought that could never be done, particularly not by a CDU government, which is so fiscally against that kind of thing. So production, got to be able to produce more. Second of all is policy. There's protectionist policies, and then there's just stupid policies. A lot of our FMS restrictions make it incredibly hard for our allies to buy stuff from us in any time frame that makes sense. I know that different European leaders have talked to President Trump about this. President Trump has given them privately assurances that he's going to find some ways to knock this down in some way or another. And then from the European side, as they come up with this new money, it's understandable if you put all this money into the system, you're going to want to create European jobs and you're going to want to put it into Europe. But if the best stuff to buy is in Korea or if it's in the United States, that would be a better way to go. But so we have to watch out for our own policy. And then the politics, and this gets to trade. You know, the UK, which has a trade surplus with us, has just settled for a 10% tariff base as a deal, where you're paying 10% more tariffs even though you have a trade surplus with us. Europe looks at that deal and says, well, that's not a very good deal. We don't want to agree to that. And so I think we can't see these things as unrelated. We're going to have to settle our trade disagreements if we want to get on the same side in terms of, and I think we can get there, but it's going to take some tough negotiations. I think they're trying to get to an EU-US agreement by the end of July with some papers changing hands now. But, you know, market was down 800 points yesterday. Your treasuries are in some trouble. The dollar is in some trouble. I think there are enough signals out there right now that that the tariff issues have to be dealt with and dealt with relatively quickly.
Thank you. Ramon?
Yeah, I want to address the gentleman's question. So you asked basically, are there initiatives to guarantee that we get what we need from either Europe or the US or from friendly countries? So yes, so as was mentioned, for instance, the European Union is going to put 800 billion more into defense, and of course the Commission is also looking at the supply chain and making sure that as much as possible of that will come from the North Atlantic area. So one thing I want to stress in relation to that is this is something that we should be doing. What we should not be doing and what we should not be talking about or discussing is how to build barriers inside NATO. So for instance, you know, there's talk in Europe, all these EU funds, can they end up in the UK economy? And there are some in Europe, and I'm not going to mention any countries, bonjour,
Yeah.
but they feel that perhaps, you know, this is not a good idea, or at least that we should open some issues that were not decided during the Brexit talks and the aftermath of Brexit. And so, so if anybody thinks that, for instance, we should open the question of fisheries while we are facing an existential threat from Russia and we need to cooperate in our defense industry, I would say to those people what Joe Biden said to Iran: don't do it. And also it comes to the U.S. I mean, come on, guys. I mean, it's like it's ridiculous that we're talking about, oh, perhaps, you know, we need to de-risk from the U.S. economy. I mean, are you kidding me? You know, I agree with our Secretary General Mark Rutte completely that we need a strong North Atlantic defense industry. We need to cooperate. Estonia will definitely continue to buy from the U.S. and I hope the U.S. will start buying from Estonia, and everybody will be happy and prosperous because of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Clearly, you haven't faced hungry French fishers.
Oh, I did not mention any countries at all. I'm not singling anybody out.
With apologies to those that I didn't get to turn to. I'm so sorry, but I give you the last word, Trond.
Yeah, just another mentioning, because we started with the war in Ukraine, and I think there are many initiatives regarding the last question, also that the Ukrainians are now starting to produce, for example, Norwegian weapons, other weapons in Ukraine, because they have, as we discussed, capacity now. They want to do it, they're able to do it, and I think we should really support those initiatives, that they also can start producing artillery shells and all the stuff that they need for the war. And that goes all the way. Norway has quite a good defense industry, but what we are doing, we are setting up factories in the US when we are delivering to US. And that's of course a way to do it. That's helpful, because then we avoid the tariff problems, and we got a good result for our companies.
Thank you. Well, we're at time. I don't know about you guys, but I felt it was a privilege to be part of this conversation. We certainly had plenty to talk about. It was a perfect panel to answer some of these questions, except for the fact that we were 5 white guys, but you know, what are you going to do? But thank you so much for taking the time this morning.